My son-in-law introduced me to his colleagues that evening the way you might mention a piece of furniture. "This is Evelyn's father," he said, barely glancing in my direction. "He used to drive trucks." The men around him nodded politely and turned back to their conversations. Someone laughed at something unrelated. A waiter passed with a tray of shrimp cocktail, and just like that, I ceased to exist. The party was held on the rooftop terrace of a hotel in downtown Nashville. My daughter Evelyn had organized it to celebrate her husband's promotion to regional vice president at Hargrove Capital Partners, the kind of firm where everyone under 40 wears cufflinks and speaks in acronyms. The rooftop had been decorated with string lights and small potted olive trees, and the skyline behind it glowed amber and purple in the early October dusk. It was beautiful. I'll give them that. I stood near the far end of the terrace, holding a glass of sparkling water because I hadn't touched alcohol in 11 years. My suit was dark navy, not the sharpest thing in the room, but clean and well-fitted. I had driven up from Cookeville that afternoon 3 hours each way because my daughter had asked me to come, and I never say no to Evelyn. Her husband's name was Preston Aldrich. He was 38 years old, smooth-talking, and genuinely talented at making you feel like the least interesting person in any room. I don't think he did it on purpose. It was just his nature, the way some people are born, knowing how to fill space, and others are born knowing how to build things. Preston filled space beautifully. Evelyn found me near the railing about 40 minutes into the evening. She looked radiant in a burgundy dress, her hair pinned up the way her mother used to wear hers. Seeing her like that, happy and glowing in a room full of people who admired her, I felt the kind of pride that sits quiet and deep in your chest. "Dad." She kissed my cheek. "You're hiding again." "I'm enjoying the view," I said. She looped her arm through mine and looked out over the city. "Preston's going to make a toast in a little while. He wants everyone together near the center. I'll be there." She squeezed my arm. "You okay? Better than okay?" She studied my face the way she has since she was about 9 years old, always trying to read what I wasn't saying. Then she smiled and let it go. The toast happened shortly after. Preston stood at the center of the terrace with a glass of champagne and the comfortable confidence of a man who had never once doubted he belonged wherever he was standing. He thanked his team, his mentors, the managing partners of Hargrove. He thanked Evelyn, which made her smile, and he did it genuinely, which I respected. Then he began introducing people. His parents, who had flown in from Scottsdale, his business school roommate, now a hedge fund manager in Chicago, his college mentor, a former economics professor. Each introduction came with a little story, a credential, something that anchored the person to a world of weight and consequence. Then he turned toward where I was standing. "And this," he said with a good-natured wave in my direction, "is Evelyn's dad. Retired now. He was a long-haul trucker most of his life." He smiled pleasantly. "Spent about 30 years out on the open road, isn't that right?" I nodded once. "Salt of the earth," Preston added, and a few people smiled at that, the kind of smile people give when they want to seem warm but don't know what else to do with the information. Evelyn's expression flickered for just a moment. She recovered quickly, but I saw it. I kept my face still. "Salt of the earth. That's what you say about someone when you want to compliment them without actually including them in anything. I had heard variations of it for years. Good, honest work. Nothing wrong with that. He's a simple man, but a good one." The words were never cruel. That was almost the harder part. Across the terrace, one of Preston's colleagues, a man I'd been introduced to briefly as Warren Lyle, the senior managing partner, was watching me. Not the way people watch someone to make conversation, the way people watch someone when they're trying to place a face. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the measured stillness of a man who had spent decades making decisions that mattered. He was holding a glass of bourbon, and he hadn't looked away since Preston said the word trucker. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and looked out at the skyline. Dinner was served buffet-style at long tables along the west side of the terrace. I filled a plate with brisket and roasted vegetables and found a seat near the edge of the gathering. Preston's colleagues circulated in clusters, talking deals, projections, the Fed, a new development corridor opening up in East Nashville. I understood every word of it. I just didn't say so. Preston's father sat down across from me. He was a trim, tan man named Gerald Aldrich, early 70s, recently retired from a career in commercial real estate in Phoenix. He was pleasant enough. We talked about the weather, the drive up from Cookeville, the price of diesel. "Evelyn tells me you're fully retired now," he said. "More or less," I replied. "Must be nice, taking it easy." He speared a piece of carrot. "What was your route mostly? East Coast, Midwest, all of it at one point or another?" He nodded with polite interest. "That's a hard life, long hours. Time away from family?" It was. "But you're done with all that now." Not a question, really, more of a reassurance, like he was confirming that the chapter was safely behind me. "Mostly," I said again. Evelyn appeared beside me briefly during dessert, leaning down to whisper in my ear. "Are you sure you're okay, Evelyn? You've been very quiet." "I'm always quiet at parties." "You're being more quiet than usual." I looked up at her. "Go be with your husband." "I'm fine." She hesitated, then nodded and went. Preston drifted by about 10 minutes later with two of his colleagues, refilling drinks and circulating the way good hosts do. He stopped when he reached my table. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "getting enough to eat?" "Plenty," I said. One of the colleagues, a younger man I hadn't met, glanced at me with polite curiosity. "Evelyn's father, right?" "Preston said you were a trucker." "Long haul, mostly," I confirmed. The young man nodded with the exact expression Gerald Aldrich had used. "Respectful, concluding." "Long way from here," he said, gesturing vaguely at the rooftop. "Not as far as you'd think," I replied. He smiled uncertainly, and they moved on. I had built my first company when I was 31 years old. It started as a single refrigerated truck hauling produce between Nashville and Atlanta, contracted out to a regional grocery chain that nobody remembered anymore. By the time I was 38, I had a fleet of 22 trucks and a transportation contract with 3 major distribution centers in the Southeast. By my mid-40s, Callaway Freight and Logistics had grown into something that covered 11 states and operated close to 400 vehicles. We moved food, pharmaceuticals, industrial equipment, construction materials. We had dispatch centers in Nashville, Charlotte, and Kansas City. I sold the controlling stake 14 years ago when I was 51 to a national logistics firm out of Atlanta. I retained a minority position and stayed on for 2 years as a consultant. Then I stepped back, moved to a quieter house in Cookeville, and let the company become someone else's problem. None of that was in Preston's introduction. To be fair, I had never told Evelyn the full scope of it. She knew I had run a trucking company. She knew it had grown. But I had always downplayed the numbers, partly out of habit, partly because I never wanted her to feel the weight of it, and partly because I had watched too many people let money define every conversation they had and every room they walked into. I didn't want to be that man. So I was apparently just a trucker. I excused myself from a table and walked to the far end of the terrace. The city spread out below me, quiet and enormous. A freight train moved slowly along the rail corridor south of downtown, its cars stacked with containers I could have named the contents of just by the markings on the sides. Some habits don't leave you. You've been watching that train for about 5 minutes. I turned. Warren Lyle was standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Up close, he had the kind of eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by most things. "Old habit," I said. He stepped up to the railing beside me. "I worked in logistics for a while, early in my career," he said. "Before finance, never could stop watching freight move." "Where were you?" "Atlanta mostly. Mid-90s. I was doing due diligence work for a private equity group that was looking at transportation acquisitions." He paused. "One of the companies we evaluated was a regional fleet operation out of Nashville." I said nothing. Warren looked at me sideways. "Small outfit at the time. About 20 trucks." Owner was a young guy, early 40s, very sharp, had a way of explaining operational logistics that made the rest of the room feel like they were catching up. Long time ago, I said. It is, he agreed, but I have a good memory for faces. He turned toward me fully. And for names. The company was called Callaway Freight. The string lights hummed softly in the October air. Some way below us, a car horn sounded once and faded. That was a different time, I said. Warren studied me for a moment. The group I was with didn't end up acquiring you. Owner wasn't ready to sell. He almost smiled. Smart decision, as it turned out. Company was worth considerably more a decade later. I didn't respond. I read about the eventual sale, he said. Atlanta firm, reported somewhere north of 300 million. He looked out over the city again, give or take. The number hung between us without ceremony. You came all this way to celebrate your son-in-law's promotion, Warren said. My daughter asked me. He nodded. And you let Preston introduce you as a retired trucker. I looked at him. I was a trucker. You were also the founder of one of the largest regional freight companies in the Southeast. He tilted his head slightly. Those aren't mutually exclusive, but they're not the same introduction. No, I agreed. They're not. Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Hargrove has been looking at a transportation infrastructure investment, new logistics corridor through the Mid-South. He glanced at me. You'd know that terrain better than anyone in our firm. Probably, I said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. He set it on the railing in front of me without any ceremony. If you are interested in a conversation, he said. I looked at the card but didn't pick it up. I'll think about it, I said. Warren nodded once, like that was exactly the answer he expected. Then he picked up his bourbon glass. I'm going to go find my wife, he said. She's been talking to Gerald Aldrich for 20 minutes, and she has a 45-minute limit on real estate stories. He paused. Good to meet you properly, Mr. Callaway. He walked back toward the center of the terrace. I stood at the railing for a while longer. The freight train had disappeared south, its lights swallowed by the distance. I thought about the 30 years before the sale, the early mornings, the dispatch calls at 3 a.m., the drivers I knew by name and by family situation, the breakdowns on I-40 in February, the year we nearly lost everything when a major contract collapsed and I remortgaged the house to make payroll without telling anyone. Preston had said salt of the earth. He wasn't wrong exactly, he just didn't know what the earth had produced. I eventually walked back inside, found a quiet chair near the bar, and watched the rest of the party from there. Evelyn came to find me twice more, and each time I told her I was fine, and each time she looked at me with that particular expression that said she suspected something had shifted but couldn't locate the source. The party wound down around 10. People gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. I was waiting near the elevator bank when Preston appeared beside me, jacket loosened, tie pulled down slightly, the relaxed version of himself that came out after enough champagne and professional success in one evening. Good night, sir, he said. Glad you could make it. Congratulations on the promotion, I said. He nodded, pleased. Evelyn says you're heading back to Cookville tonight? I prefer driving at night, less traffic. He chuckled. Old trucker's habit. Something like that. He started to move away, then stopped. Hey, Warren Lyle pulled me aside before he left. Preston looked at me with an expression that was trying to decide what it was. He said to make sure I introduced him to you properly next time. Said he'd met you years ago. A pause. Said you were a name in the industry. I looked at my son-in-law. He was smart enough to feel the ground shifting beneath something, not smart enough yet to know what it was. Warren's generous, I said. Preston frowned slightly. Is there something I should know about? I considered that for a moment. Evelyn appeared from across the lobby then, her heels in her hand, coat over one arm, laughing at something someone had said. She looked younger like that, unguarded, happy. She looked like herself. Walk me to the elevator, I said to Preston. We stepped away from the main crowd. He waited. "You introduced me tonight as a retired trucker," I said. He shifted slightly. "Was that not right?" "It wasn't wrong," I said. "I drove long haul for the first decade. That part's accurate. But," he said, "but I also spent about 20 years building a company around that work, Callaway Freight and Logistics. I kept my voice even. At our peak, we were running close to 400 vehicles across 11 states. I sold the controlling interest in 2011. Preston stared at me. "The sale was structured in tranches," I continued. "The final tranche cleared about 4 years after closing. Warren Lyle was part of the PE group that evaluated us in the 90s, before we were worth acquiring." I paused. He remembered. My son-in-law's face cycled through several expressions in a short period of time. Surprise, something close to embarrassment. Then a kind of recalibration that happened visibly, like a man adjusting his footing. "Evelyn never told me," he said. "Evelyn doesn't know the full picture." I never pressed it. "Why not?" I thought about how to answer that. The elevator arrived and the doors opened. Neither of us moved to get in. I spent most of my working life being the man in the room who knew how everything moved, I said. Supply chains, routes, loads, contracts. I understood the system from the inside, from the bottom up, because I had driven it before I managed it. I looked at him. "But every room I walked into at your level treated that background as something to move past. Something quaint, something that explained where I came from rather than what I understood." Preston said nothing. "So I stopped correcting people," I said. "It wasn't worth the effort. And honestly, after a while, I stopped being interested in the kind of rooms where it mattered." The elevator doors had closed again. Neither of us had pushed the button. "I'm not saying this to embarrass you," I continued. "You didn't know, that's fair. But," he said again, "but you introduced me to your colleagues without asking a single question first. You made an assumption about who I was, based on something Evelyn mentioned once, and you built an introduction out of that assumption." I held his gaze. "That's not a small thing, Preston. Not when you're in a business that depends on knowing who you're actually talking to." He exhaled slowly. I could see him weighing it, processing it the way analytical people do, organizing the information into columns of what it meant and what it cost. "I understand," he said quietly. "I believe you." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Warren mentioned a logistics corridor project." "He did. Are you going to talk to him?" "Probably." I pressed the elevator button. "I mostly retired, but the Mid-South Freight Corridor is genuinely interesting." "I know that land." The doors opened. I stepped in and turned around. Preston was still standing in the hallway, his jacket slightly wrinkled, his expression more thoughtful than I had seen it all evening. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't need to make a production of it." Still, he met my eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." I nodded. "Get back to your party." He almost smiled. "Yes, sir." The doors closed. I rode down alone. The lobby was quiet at that hour, marble floors gleaming under low light, a lone clerk at the front desk scrolling through something on a screen. I collected my coat from the coat check, walked out through the revolving doors, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cool October air. Nashville at night has a particular sound, music drifting from somewhere on Broadway, traffic thinning out. The low, almost subterranean hum of a city that never quite stops. I thought about Warren Lyle's business card, still sitting on the railing of the terrace 22 floors above me. I had left it there on purpose. If he was serious, he'd reach out through other channels, and a man like Warren Lyle would know how to find me. Thought about Evelyn, who would call me tomorrow morning, bright and early, with a voice full of questions she'd been holding all night. I thought about Preston, who was underneath everything a capable and serious man who had made the mistake of thinking he already knew the shape of the room he was standing in. I walked to my truck. It was a late model F-250, dark gray, nothing flashy. I had bought it because I needed to haul some equipment out to a property I was rehabbing in White County, and because old habits persist long after there's any practical reason for them. I drove out of the parking garage and merged onto the interstate. The road opened up south of the city, long and straight and dark, the way it gets once you clear the exits and the commercial strips and the lights fall away behind you. I had spent 30 years on roads like this one, in the cab of a truck that smelled like coffee and diesel and the particular silence of being in motion at 3 in the morning with nothing but white lines and radio static for company. It was in those hours that I had worked out most of the problems worth solving in my life. Routing decisions, contract structures, whether to expand or consolidate, whether to sell or hold. The road had a way of clarifying things that boardrooms never quite managed. Salt of the earth. There was a time the phrase would have stung. When I was younger and still measuring my worth against the way other people named it, those words would have found the thin place in the armor and worked their way in. But I had been in rooms where men with far more impressive introductions had very little idea of what they were actually talking about, and I had been in truck stops at 4 a.m. with drivers who could diagnose an engine fault by sound and navigate the geometry of a full load on a mountain grade in February fog. I had learned a long time ago that the introduction was never the whole story. My exit appeared in the headlights. I signaled, took the ramp, and drove the last 20 minutes through familiar county roads toward home. The house sat at the end of a gravel drive, dark except for the porch light Evelyn had made me promise to always leave on when I drove at night. I parked and sat in the truck for a minute with the engine off, listening to the sounds of a quiet country night. Crickets. A dog somewhere down the road. Whined in the oaks. My phone buzzed on the seat beside me. A text from an unknown Nashville number. Mr. Calloway. Warren Lyle. Got your number from Gerald. Hope you don't mind. I'd like to schedule a conversation about the Mid-South project when you have time. No rush. The corridor isn't going anywhere, neither is the opportunity. I looked at the message for a long moment. Then I set the phone face down on the seat and went inside. The conversation could wait until morning. Most things could. I still think about that freight train moving through the dark below the terrace. Preston was making a toast 20 feet away, and I was watching a line of containers roll south on the rail corridor and thinking, I know exactly what's in those cars and where they're going. That's a strange thing to carry quietly inside yourself, while someone calls you salt of the earth. But here's what I've learned about quiet. It isn't the same as small. I spent decades being the man who understood how everything moved, the routes, the weight limits, the contracts, the thin margins that kept drivers employed and families fed, and I learned early that the people who talk loudest in a room are rarely the ones who build anything with their hands. I chose not to correct Preston that night, not because I was ashamed, but because I had already done the work. The work doesn't require an audience to have been real, what Preston did. And I don't say this to condemn him, because he's a capable man who will learn, was make the oldest mistake in any business or any life. He decided he already knew the shape of the room before he'd asked a single question. That kind of certainty is comfortable. It saves time, but it costs you the truth of who you're actually standing next to, and eventually that bill comes due. It came due on a rooftop in Nashville on a Tuesday night in October. And the man who collected it was Warren Lyle, who had spent 40 years in rooms where assumptions got people fired. There's something I want to say about how I got from a single refrigerated truck on I-24 to a company running 400 vehicles across 11 states, because it wasn't cleverness alone, and it wasn't luck. It was showing up when it was hard to show up. It was making payroll in February of 2003, when a major contract collapsed, and I remortgaged the house without telling a soul, because my drivers had families, and that was simply what you did. It was understanding that the man who can fix the problem at 3 in the morning is worth 10 men who can describe the problem at a conference table. I built everything I built on that understanding, and I never forgot where it came from. When Evelyn calls me tomorrow morning, and she will, I'm going to tell her the same thing I told Preston at the elevator. Not to embarrass anyone, not to reclaim something, but because she deserves to know the full shape of the life her father lived, and because there is something important in that shape worth passing on, that you can be underestimated your entire career and still build something that outlasts the estimation. That integrity isn't a strategy. It's the thing you hold on to when every strategy fails. That the grit it takes to get back in a truck at 4 in the morning after a breakdown on a mountain grade in February is the same grit that keeps a company alive through a crisis, and it doesn't matter what you call it as long as you don't put it down. Warren's text is still on my phone. The Mid-South Corridor project is real, and he's right that I know their terrain better than anyone in his firm. I'll probably call him Thursday. But tonight I sat on the porch in Cookville and listened to the oaks and thought about what it means to have spent your life building something invisible. Infrastructure, systems, the quiet machinery that keeps everything else moving. Most people never see it. They just notice when it breaks. That's all right. The work was still worth doing.